So this is the continuation of a series of videos explaining the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali. This is the one on Book 1, Sutra 3, and I've titled it Self-Abiding, and it is a comparative study course by Dr. Lisa Love of 3 books. The Light on the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali by B.K.S. Iyengar, The Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali by Swami Satchidananda, The Light of the Soul, which is a commentary on the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali by Alice Bailey. So let's look at how our 3 authors translate the Sanskrit, starting with Swami Satchidananda. Then the seer, or self, abides in his own nature. B.K.S. Iyengar. Then the seer dwells in his own true splendor. And Alice Bailey. When this has been accomplished, the yogi knows himself as he is in reality. So as with all these videos, I attempt to give my simple interpretation first, summarizing the explanations that we're going to see coming. So basically, the sutra is saying, who is the seer? Who is the self? Who are you, the yogi, in reality? Essentially, you are the seer, you are the self, and that's the yoga, to transfer your self from the way you view it to the self you really are, and we'll explain that more in this video in a moment. So this seer or self is spoken of in many spiritual traditions. It's given many different names as you realize that self. That self may be the Christ consciousness. It may be the Buddha nature. It is often called self-realization. You realize the self. It is called the Atma, the I am, the presence, and a lot of names that basically mean the same thing. I call it the peaceful self. And over again, we get glimpses of the self we are, but beyond these glimpses is the task of remaining or abiding within the splendor of that self. This is also found in the tradition of Buddhism, as one learns to not just abide, but have steady or calm abiding within your Buddha nature. Now, the Yoga Sutras help you to do this, so you do not forget the self or the you that you are. Let's look, first of all, at what Swami Satchidananda has to say. And summarizing the books here again, please read them yourself. I'm giving you just short little excerpts from what our authors have to say. He says yoga is primarily about realizing who you really are as the self. And as you subdue the ego, you know yourself as the self, which Satchidananda also calls the seer. Then the seer or self abides in his own nature. Here's a quote from him. You are the knower or seer. You always see your body-mind acting in front of you. You know that the mind is creating thoughts. It distinguishes and desires. The seer knows that, but is not involved in it. Another quote, to understand that eternal, peaceful you, the mind must be quiet. And finally, the seer or true you reflect in the mind, which is your mirror. So we get this idea that you no longer identify with your mind, your emotions, or your body. Instead, you identify with who you really are as the seer or the self. Now let me give you a different kind of way of looking at this, borrowed from video games. Now, those of you that have watched the previous videos are already familiar with this model. These 3, the physical, the emotional, the mental, constitute the ego. Now, another way to look at that ego is like an avatar that you create in a video game. Now, we're not using the word avatar in the way it's used in India, where it's a highly evolved spiritual being. I don't know how in video games they started to use avatar in a different way, but the avatar, like the movie Avatar, is a being that you create, who goes in and explores a virtual world. Now, in much the same way, you are the self or the seer, and you have created an avatar who is exploring the world that you live in. For example, Dr. Lisa Love is the avatar who is living in this world in the 2000s when these videos were created in California, where Dr. Lisa Love lives. that is simply the ego. That is an expression of the self that is not the true self. So the key is to watch the seer, watches Dr. Lisa Love in this video game, making this video for you, having certain thoughts, desires, certain relationships with people, eating certain foods, traveling certain places. But I am the self. I am the seer. And I am the observer who is observing the avatar, Dr. Lisa Love. Here is another way to look at it. There is an ego identity confusion that prevents us from seeing who we really are as the seer or the self. And that happens because we get caught up in thinking that we are the avatar in the video game. Another way of talking about it is we begin to see the me, the little smiley face, Dr. Lisa Love, for example, the avatar, as only part of the brain. I am only the localized brain consciousness. I am not the universal self or the non-localized universal consciousness. And because I am confused and I think I am only this little limited blip called Dr. Lisa Love, this little limited me stuck in a brain, I think that I dictate to the universe what it needs to do. And for the most part, the universe is a lifeless thing out there. And it's my job with my limited brain consciousness to dictate to the universe what it needs to do. Usually to satisfy my needs, my desires, my separated sense of self, my ego. But when we switch and we identify with the peaceful self, we identify with the universal self, the seer, non-localized universal consciousness, then we relate to Lisa or the avatar in a different way. We see it. We watch it, much as in this picture, she's watching what's inside the screen, inside the video game, but we are not caught up in it. We are not identified with it. So knowing this, let's look at how Iyengar handles this particular sutra. And these are all quotes, and he's got a lot more to say, but here's some of the ones I picked out. First of all, when the waves of consciousness are stilled in silence, they can no longer distort the true expression of the soul. Revealed in his own nature, the radiant seer abides in his own grandeur. Here's another quote. When the mind is restrained and regulated, a reflective state of being is experienced. The vision of the soul radiates without any activity on the part of the chitta. Once it is realized, the soul abides in its own seat. So again, the idea here is to still the waves of consciousness, to still the activity of the chitta, the mind, to restrain and regulate the mind, to get it quiet so it can be reflective, like a pool of water becomes still and calm so it can reflect the sky and the sun above. We want to do that with the ego. We want to do that with the mind so that we use it and we also can consciously direct it in much more positive ways, but we're not identified with it. We're disidentified from our mind, our emotions, our physical body. And when that happens, the vision of the soul shines forth. The soul that we are, the seer that we are, and it is able to abide in its own seat, to remain in its own true splendor without being distorted anymore. Let's look now at what Alice Bailey has to say. And in her book, she repeats the theme of the self as your true nature. However, she views it as a series of progressive, enlightened realizations or expansions of consciousness, which in her book she calls initiations. There is no one big enlightenment you have and that's it. Everything is done. Rather, it is a series of awakenings or initiations or expansions or realizations and then losing it, awakening and losing it. And we see that same theme in the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali as we go along in the following sutras. This idea we remember who we are and we forget. And you have that same theme in Buddhism until you have calm abiding. Or in Christianity, where the Christ in you, the hope of glory, is seated on the kingdom of heaven next to the Father in heaven. You have these same kinds of parallels if you know how to see them in different spiritual traditions. So again, enlightenment is not just a one-time phenomena. There are a series of enlightenments that help you not only see the self, but allow you to discover it is your true nature, so that you can identify increasingly within it, dwell at its center, and become spiritually conscious, and finally awaken to the being, the God within. So here is the model again that if you're following the videos you're already familiar with, you're going to get even more familiar with. You're going to get to know this so well you're not even going to think twice about it. And here I'm going to talk about it as a series of awakenings. The ego, or the ahamkara, remember, has the mental level, which is called chitta, manas, mind in the various books, the emotional level, which Bailey also calls the psychic nature, desire, mind, and the physical level. And here is the self or spiritual level. So you are attempting to abide in the Buddhic and Atmic planes within the self that you are. But too often we fall back down into the realms of the ego, back down into our thoughts, our emotions, our physical nature, and we forget the higher spiritual levels. We're back in the ego or the ahamkara, the selfish levels, where it's all about my thoughts, my needs, my desires, my emotions, my physical stuff, my physical body, my fitness, how good I look, blah, 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 blah. Me, 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 me. Now, there's nothing wrong with taking good care of yourself, but at the self or spiritual levels, you learn to do it differently. You learn to do it for the sake of service, not for the sake of attention or pleasure or power or money, so you can have pleasure or power. Now, in her model, she adds this other thing, which is called there the egoic lotus. And this lotus is like a flower where you move from egoic levels into self or spiritual levels. And she identifies this egoic lotus as the soul. Now, these are states of realization, states of consciousness is what these are. And in this particular model, it looks like a step ladder, but that's not really how it is. Another way you could look at this is as holons. So here is the physical level that expands in awareness. Here is the emotional level, the mental level, the Buddhic level, and the Atmic levels. Now, the only problem with this particular illustration is it looks like here I am, the avatar, expanding out to realize the self. The truth is, you are the self, and you are attempting to get the avatar to vibrate at the same frequency that you are as the self, so that the self can abide in its own seat. So what are the qualities of Buddhic consciousness? What does it mean when we get to these spiritual levels? Well, here's a few that especially Bailey talks about. Buddhi is primarily understanding, compassion, inclusivity, and intuition. Now, Buddhi also includes wisdom, which is part of intelligence and discernment, known as viveka in the Indian Sanskrit, in a heart-filled way, however. It's not just a keen intellectual mind that can really discern reality and see the truth. It has a heartfelt connection, because in the realization of the self is the realization of unity with all things, all beings. And it's not a mushy, devotional, well-intentioned love. It's a clear, precise, and wise love. It's a love that intelligently knows how to love, how to serve. It not only has a sense of I'm one with everything around me, It knows how to serve and uplift and heal and nurture all beings that I am. It's a love that expands the consciousness of oneself and others, or to put it more appropriately, it expands the consciousness of the avatars all running around in those little video games in this video game called Living Here on Planet Earth. And here we are trying to expand the consciousness so that increasingly all those little avatars move into the Buddhic plane where they realize their unity, their connection. Now, it operates mostly as intuitions and insights that arise only when the lower levels of mind are silent. And this is really important. Bailey has a book that talks about the difference between instinct, intellect, and intuition. What a lot of people call intuition is just simply instinct in her mind. It's conditioned response. It's what you already know in your genetic makeup about how to grow cells in your body or how to regenerate skin. It's what you already know based on the conditioning, what you were taught to do as a child in your culture, etc. Instinct is based upon reactions, based upon the known. Intuition is based upon the unknown. And that can only happen when you are identified with the self, when the self abides in its own seat as the seer, and when the mind, the modifications of the mind stuff, are silent. So true intuition involves the new. So that is our brief understanding of Book 1, Sutra 3. As with all these videos, the most important part is to practice it. You can get the philosophy and a general understanding, but until you practice it, it doesn't do you any good. It's like wanting to lose weight by simply reading books about how to without ever going to the gym or learning how to eat right or taking better care of yourself. So, look for the meditation associated with this sutra called the disidentification exercise. And I encourage you to practice it on a daily basis for at least 1 week during your study of the sutra. And if you are actually working in the study course, then here's a reminder of how I encourage you to work together. And that's followed by a little bit more about me and how to contact me if you need to.